It seems like an absolutely bizarre thing to say that the story of a racing engine, even if it's one of the greatest ever conceived, could actually carry a high level of emotional weight. But this one does. The famed Offenhauser four-cylinder engine has a story that is without compare in the annals of motorsports globally. A near last-minute creation to try and save a dying company, its narrative spans across some 7 decades of competition. The Offy survived bankruptcies, multiple owners, a depression, a fuel crisis or two, a full frontal attack from one of the world's largest automakers, a world war, interpersonal battles among the men building them, and a cornucopia of rule changes and revisions designed to force it out to pasture. Add to that abuse with nitromethane fuel and so much more, and you have a story of an engine that was unkillable. This is a story of men, of machines, of passion, good decisions and bad, dedication, and innovation by some of the most talented hands and minds in 20th century American motor racing. My aim in this video is to give you the complete story of the Offenhauser, its origins, the people that built it, maintained it, revived it, and stood by it when it seemed to be dead and buried multiple times. The story will carry us from the 1920s all the way into the 1980s. Parts of it will make you wince. Parts of it will make you think. But in the end, I want you to understand that this little engine, which in its largest form barely exceeded 300 cubic inches, looms even larger and is more impressive in fact than even in its mythology. Like so many great story arcs, this one begins unexpectedly, moves to underdog heroics, evolves into a level of domination that becomes vilified, transitions into a comeback story the likes of which has never been seen again in the racing world, and then moves into a battle of survival that has left me and so many others endeared to this little cube of iron and aluminum. This is the story of the engine that wouldn't die, the Offenhauser four-cylinder. An immense amount of research, reading, personal interaction, and searching went into this video. My major sources include Mark Dees and the Miller Legacy, Cliff Borgeson's book Miller, Gordon Elliott White's Offenhauser, the legendary racing engine and the men who built it, Sports Car Graphic Magazine, Hot Rod Magazine, Griff Borgeson's The Golden Age of the American Racing Car, and a host of websites digested for historical context and fact-checking. A personal thank you goes out to Joshua Shaw for his support and for some of the research materials used in the creation of this piece of work. The story of the Offenhauser does not start, and for that matter does not end, with Fred Offenhauser. He's soon to join this tale, but first we have to take it to the very beginning, and that means you need to meet Harry Artemus Miller. Born in Wisconsin circa 1875, Miller had educated parents who foresaw a successful future in a dignified field of study like medicine for their bright son. The problem is, Harry Miller's future seemed to be already written into the stars. He was obsessed with machines and machinery as a young boy. School, especially subjects like math, were not of interest to him. His entire life would be defined by the fact that, while not formally educated, his intrinsic understanding of complex machines and how they worked was seemingly implanted into his DNA. At 13 years old, to the horror of his parents, he quit school to take a job, a low-rung job, in a machine shop. In short order, he was one of the finest machinists and mechanics in the area, and he was placed in charge of maintaining and repairing these so-called donkey engines that were used at local lumber camps to run saws and local brickyards where it provided the motive power for the brick-making operation. These stationary engines were large, basic things and vital to the operation of these businesses. By all account, he kept them running in perfect order. By 19, he tired of the routine that his job had brought and decided to move west. In 1895, while living in the Los Angeles area, he worked at a bicycle shop for $18 a week. On the side, he kept a small machining and manufacturing operation. In it, he was making high-performance bicycle parts for the craze that was bicycle racing at this time. After living in a couple of California locations, concentrating on bicycle work, he transitioned to automotive work in about 1905. In 1906, he filed a patent for a new spark plug design, and other applications went in as well. In 1908, along with a pair of investors, he had his own engine design patented. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like any were actually built, but the fact that he got the patent is pretty great. It was, though, in 1909 when Harry A. Miller struck pay dirt for the first time. Through the years, he had been designing, mostly in his mind, a new and improved style of carburetor. In January of that year, he filed for and was granted a patent on it in December. Manufacturing began with a meager supply of old tools and machines in a shed behind his small Los Angeles house, and this was long before his official patent notification was mailed to him. It needs to be reinforced here that Miller was not an engineer. In many ways, he was an artist. He was not proficient in advanced math. His ideas were manifested into reality by his own mind and hands, not a draftsman's table. Miller was a guy who slept very little, kind of lived his life in a constant state of deep thought, and he had the ability to work for days on end with little to no stopping. He believed that higher powers were passing these ideas to him, and that his ability to produce the ideas into reality was also being guided by invisible forces. That's not something I'm making up. That's something he was quoted as saying to multiple people, including his wife Edna. He was eccentric in many ways and held a personal belief that he also possessed a level of clairvoyance.
Hey everybody, it's Brian Loans. I'd like to thank Upside for sponsoring today's video. Upside is a very easy, free-to-use app that allows you to earn cash back on the stuff that you're buying on a day-to-day basis. I'm talking cash back on groceries, cash back on restaurant visits, even cash back, of course, on gasoline. We all know that is a good thing. I decided to use the app this afternoon. I was out in the garage wrenching with my son, and he did such a good job with the wrenches, I decided to buy him a tank of gas. So I popped the app open, selected the local offer I want, and then we cruised to the gas station in his car. I pumped the gas like I normally would, and then printed out my receipt. Once you have the receipt, you upload it to the Upside app, and it takes just a matter of seconds. In a short amount of time, the cash is applied directly to your account. Now the neatest part is when you decide to cash out, you can pick your bank account or any number of areas and locations to apply that cash to. There's all kinds of options with Upside, and there really is no reason you should not be using this. You can use Brian Loans as a promo code and receive an additional 25 cents per gallon off your first gasoline purchase. You can hit the code on the screen right now and make sure you jump right on there and get the app. Upside is great. I use it often. It's super easy to use, and it's an absolute no-brainer. Check it out. Available at 100,000 locations nationwide, and people are earning collectively $1 million a week on this thing. Get some cash back for the stuff you're buying every day. Now, let's get back to the video.
The Miller carburetor became dominant in an amazingly short period of time. If you had a race car and did not have a Miller carburetor on it, you were not going to be a factor in the battle for first place. In 1912, Charles Fairbanks bought the company and all its assets, moved it to Indy, and Miller went with it, but only for a short while. The weather didn't agree with him. He was back in the warmer climates of Los Angeles by the end of the year. In April of 1913, Miller opened the Master Carburetor Company to make a new and improved, even more innovative carburetor. In less than a year, it had become not only the racing carburetor of choice, but it was used on airplanes, passenger cars, boats, and anything else with a piston engine. In April of 1914, an Eastern investment group bought the manufacturing rights to this carburetor and the marketing rights to the entire United States east of the Rockies. Something else happened in 1913. Miller, among his other talents, was a good metallurgist. He had actually created his own alloy using aluminum, nickel, and copper. He called it aluminum, and he planned to use it for carburetor bodies. Now, on a whim, he made some pistons out of it, and these were a revelation. Harry Miller is believed to be the first person to concentrate on making pistons of aluminum in the United States, maybe the world, and they were an instant hit for anybody building a high-performance racing engine. The Harry A. Miller Manufacturing Company was absolutely roaring along, and Harry Miller needed help. Fred Offenhauser was born in 1888. His father was a barber and assumed that his son would be brought into that trade when he grew old enough and tall enough to cut hair. Like Harry Miller, Fred Offenhauser had other ideas. At the age of 12, totally enthralled with machines, he took a bottom-level job at a machine shop after school. While learning like a sponge, making very little money, and spending every waking hour at the shop, Offenhauser was walking a path in life that would ultimately make him immortal in racing circles. In 1903, he became an apprentice machinist in the shop of the Pacific Electric Railway. In terms of size, scope, quality, and training, it legitimately got no better than a railroad machine shop in the early 1900s. In terms of pay, The apprentice machinist actually opened a barber shop with his dad to cut hair part-time to make ends meet. By 1909, he'd never cut hair again, only metal. Offenhauser, at 21 years old, was a journeyman machinist who rocketed up the ranks of the railway machine shop to the highest rank of tool and die maker, and he did it in the shortest possible time. Offenhauser was now building the machines that made the railroad equipment. After 8 years at the railway, Offenhauser was interested in a new challenge, and he was interested in trying to make some more money. It was 1913, and in the newspaper he spotted an advertisement for an opening at the Harry A. Miller Manufacturing Company, and he decided to apply. Miller's exploding piston business called for more help and fast. Hiring Offenhauser, perhaps the smartest and most important hire of his life, it took almost no time for the artistic and empirically genius Miller to recognize what he had in Fred. In no time, Offenhauser was pulled aside and offered the position of running the machine shop. While he appreciated the offer and wanted to do it, Offenhauser gave Miller conditions. He was to be the supreme authority in that part of the business. He controlled hiring and firing, the layout and physical execution of the shop, and effectively every other element of the machine shop fell under his purview. Miller, who really didn't have any interest in running the machine shop himself, agreed to all of these conditions, and in lightning time, the shop was cleaned, organized, and run in a fashion that made it one of, if not the finest machine shop and small private enterprise in the country. As a guy who manufactured carburetors, pistons, had a foundry and a machine shop, Harry Miller was pretty popular with the racers of that era, and that made the plant a big kind of hangout for them. They particularly enjoyed hanging out when their race cars were broken and they needed help. This meant that there was always a lot of side projects happening at Harry A. Miller Manufacturing. The pair, along with the talented staff, had the reputation of being able to fix or make basically anything. Making custom pistons, connecting rods, and other materials for guys who needed parts, repairing engines of a spectrum of styles and makes along the way. As described in one book, the broken engines were the, quote, textbooks of Miller and Offenhauser, and they used them, as well as the experience in fixing them, to hone their craft. And then they met Bob Berman. Now, Bob Berman was one of the nation's best-known race car drivers, and he happened to be racing a Peugeot Grand Prix car in contests all over the country. Running the car hard on the boards, dirt, and every other possible surface, the engine finally gave up. And so it did in spectacular fashion, taking the crankshaft, connecting rods, and other major parts with it, even damaging the block, potentially beyond repair. Now, he arrived with this sorry mess at the Miller plant in late 1913. He asked Miller and Offenhauser to fix it, and fix it as fast as they could, basically giving the men a 4-month window to complete the job. Offenhauser was initially resistant to the work, but he was convinced by Miller to fully analyze the job and come up with a plan. So he did. He told Miller that it would only be possible to take this job on if he was given a dedicated crew that worked 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week. Miller quoted Berman a price of $4,000, which is the modern equivalent of $130,000 today, and he took it. Miller, Offenhauser, and draftsman John Edwards set to work, and they set to work around the clock to get the job done on time. This was an exceptionally complex job for the era. For starters, the metric engine had to be translated into imperial measurements. The men had to make from scratch the block, a complete rotating assembly that's, of course, all made by hand, and Berman wanted not the same engine he had before, but a better, improved version of it, and amazingly, that is exactly what he got. After many California foundries turned the men down for the job of pouring and casting the block, Miller found the McCauley Foundry who took on the job. They made 3 blocks, 1 for the use of the Berman engine and 2 spares. The cylinder block here needs to be explained. In the Peugeot design, the head and the cylinders are all one integral unit. So the cylinder block was just that. The cylinders themselves with the combustion chambers and ports were in one unit, and the crankcase, which bolted to the bottom of it, was simply where the crankshaft lived. Unlike modern engines where the cylinder heads come off the block, in this case, and like it would be for the Offy, the cylinders in the head were one piece. This eliminated head gaskets and the potential for sealing issues. The McCauley Foundry would forever be the place of choice for all Miller engines and virtually every Offy block ever made. Now, these guys didn't just replicate the Peugeot block, they changed it and improved it. For starters, the engine was 274 cubic inches, or 4.5 liters. Now, that was the original displacement. With 300 cubic inches being the displacement allowed for the Indy 500 rules, the guys changed the bore and stroke to 3.625 inches, or 92 millimeters, and 7.1 inches of stroke. That is a 180 millimeter stroke, which is incredible. Now, this gave him an engine that was 296 cubic inches, or just shy of 5 liters for the 4 cylinders. The crankshaft was machined of billet steel. Now, the formerly steel pistons were replaced by Miller aluminum pistons, which saved 44 ounces per piston. That is insane. The oiling system was completely revised, the ports were enlarged, larger valves were installed, the compression ratio was raised, new camshafts were made, and Miller made a set of his well-regarded forged steel tubular connecting rods for it as well. When complete, the engine was lighter, far more powerful, and had anvil-like reliability. Berman drove it to a 6th-place finish at the Indy 500 that year and raced the car incessantly from coast to coast. When word spread about the work Miller's factory was capable of doing, their phones started ringing, their mailbox started filling up, and it never stopped. In 1916, the Harry A. Miller Manufacturing Company went into the engine business. The company's first commercial engine was a 289 cubic inch single overhead camshaft 4-cylinder, which used many of the cues and design elements learned on the Peugeot project. Made immediately famous by Barney Oldfield as it was the engine and the Miller designed and constructed Golden Submarine, this engine and stunningly beautiful car really launched Miller right to the front of the American racing world. Aircraft versions of the engine were made, and in the few years between 1916 and 1919, Miller built a large V12 engine for airplanes as well as racing engines for cars, his carburetors, pistons, connecting rods, and more. Seemingly, things couldn't get any better for the black-haired, blue-eyed, 5'6" tall Harry A. Miller. But as it turns out, they were about to. Leo Goossen was born in Michigan in 1895. Born to immigrant parents, the exceptionally intelligent Goossen was forced to drop out of school as a sophomore to work and support his family's finances. He managed to get a job at General Motors to run a blueprint machine in the engineering department of the Buick Motor Division. He was paid $17.34 a month. Industrious and up for anything, young Leo was promoted swiftly to the job of keeping the drawings straight of the 20-plus draftsmen hard working at the division at the time. With a pay raise, he began to attend night school, and he hired a private tutor to work with him on advanced mathematics. 6 months later, Leo Goossen had a drafting desk of his own, and the path of his life's work was set. Leo quickly got the attention of the highest echelon of management at Buick, and he was given a private office and assigned to work on advanced experimental projects. He designed componentry for racing engines and even entire cars. Walter Marr, who co-founded Buick with David Buick himself, took Goossen with him when he retired, giving Goossen a place to live and a special workplace in his Tennessee mansion. Goossen designed a V12 for a special project commissioned by the likes of Walter P. Chrysler, who was a vice president of Buick at the time. In early 1919, Goossen was diagnosed with tuberculosis and recommended to be moved to the southwest to the dry climate. He did just that and actually worked on a ranch riding the range. He recovered and planned to move back to Michigan, but he wanted to see Los Angeles first. The city captured him. Deciding to stay in the area and looking for work, he saw an advertisement for the Harry A. Miller Manufacturing Company, and he walked in there with a letter of recommendation from Walter P. Chrysler in his pocket, was hired on the spot, and paid $30 a week, which was a really generous sum at the time. In hiring Leo Goossen, Miller had just added the third piece and the final piece of a puzzle that to this day stands as what might be the most perfect collaborative effort in American racing history. Miller was brilliant, a high-level conceptual thinker who lacked the technical know-how to properly design and precisely design his concepts. Goossen knew and understood bedrock engineering principles that Miller could perhaps mentally see but not actually figure out on paper. He also knew how to listen to Miller, understand what he was asking for, and translate it into real-world things. Goossen knew things like the stresses in engineering on fasteners, how to properly size bearings, what clearances should be, and a whole bunch more. That was his magic. Miller's magic was the creative ideas. Goossen was the technical mind and interpreter of the concepts Miller came up to, and he would take them into the functional reality of the world and to engineer designs that could be produced. Fred Offenhauser was the man who would take Goossen's impeccable designs and create their physical form from scratch. The thinker, the designer, and the maker, all three in a class of their own as individuals, but as a team, the world had seen nothing like it. It wasn't long after Goossen's hiring that military contracts began to flood into the company for war material during World War I. Business was booming, and expansion wasn't just an idea, it was a necessary reality. In 1920, Miller opened his Long Beach Avenue shop, and it was replete with a massive machining area, an entire floor for his fleet of draftsmen, a foundry for the making of pistons, and other aspects. Now, right after the war, the American economy exploded, and so did Miller's business. In 1920, the Miller T4 engine was introduced. This was a dual overhead camshaft racing piece, and it was the first dual overhead cam Miller engine. More importantly, the year of 1920 brought one of the most legendary engines out of the Miller shop, the incredible 183 cubic inch, 3-liter straight 8. It was this engine that stands as the root of the design and engineering legacy that would deliver the Offy many years later. Design elements from foreign racing engines were used on the top end of this plant, and inspiration from the indestructible Duesenbergs was used in the design of the lower end of the engine. Adding their tweaks, the 183 became the greatest engine of its moment in time. It made an estimated 185 horsepower at 4,400 RPM, and in the early 1920s, this was a jaw-dropping accomplishment. And again, consider, there was not a single computer, CNC machine, or any sort of aid involved. It was all from the minds and hands and hearts of the craftsmen that built it. With money rolling in and creativity being the name of the game, Leo Goossen designed an overhead valve conversion for the Ford Model A 4-cylinder. The company was producing fully engineered race cars now, and in 1922, Goossen was promoted to the head of design and drafting. 1922 would also be the year of another landmark accomplishment, the very first Indy 500 victory for a Miller engine. Powering Jimmy Murphy's Duesenberg chassis race car, a Miller 183 took the checkered flag. In 1923, it happened again, this time with stunning volume. A Miller won again, and the top 6 of 7 finishers, including 1 through 4, were Miller chassis with Miller power. Millers were strong in 1924 and 1925 with multiple top 10 finishes, but Duesenberg happened to be stronger those 2 years. In 1926, though, would be a year of change, and one that Miller would seize completely. For starters, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway announced that they would follow the Grand Prix formula for the 1926 race. Now, this meant that the maximum displacement would be 91 cubic inches. Yes, 91 or 1.5 liters. Miller had his plan before he'd even left the speedway. It would be a supercharged inline 8 with dual overhead camshafts. Basically a shrunken version of the 183 in many ways. Miller came home and gave Goossen the basic dimensions of the engine he wanted, leaving Leo to figure out the size of the crank, the main bearings, the rod length, the bore and stroke, bearing dimensions, oil pump capacity, cooling passages, and the cooling system volume, and, well, everything else. Miller had such implicit trust in Goossen that the engines were put into production straight off the drawings without a single prototype having been tested first. The initial engine hit the dyno 2 days before Christmas of 1925. The engine, with its supercharger, would end up producing 155 horsepower at 7,000 RPM. It became the company's best-selling product and the first all-conquering engine at the Indy 500. They were also selling their famed race cars for $10,000 apiece turnkey, and they were building those as fast as they could with a considerable backlog. The 1926 Indy 500 had 18 Miller 91-powered cars in the starting grid. A Miller won, and Millers filled 12 of the first 13 places. A Duesenberg broke up the party by finishing 5th. The wins came again in 1928 and 1929. Now in 1927, 28 Millers are in the field. In 1928, it was 24. From 1922 through 1928, Millers made up 83% of the Indy 500 field, but we've missed something rather important. While the 91 was being bought hand over fist and his mechanics and machinists were working flat out on that project, Harry had received a request for a variation on the 91 in 1926. Boat builder J.F. Hacker of Detroit wanted an overgrown 91 to fit into a racing boat for a class of competition which allowed 340 cubic inches or 5.6 liters of displacement. He had Goossen draw up a 310 cubic inch inline 8, and it was produced. Weighing 880 pounds and making more than 250 horsepower, it was a giant $4,000 piece of jewelry for any boat racer who wanted one. Unintentionally, it would become one of the most important engines that the trifecta of Miller, Offenhauser, and Goossen would ever produce. The rules makers in the boat racing world were starting to panic with the escalation of cost and available power in the custom engine world. There was a popular class for 151 cubic inch and under hydroplanes. This is a 2.5-liter class, of course. The Miller 91 8-cylinder was not going to be allowed, so he needed a solution. As it turned out, making a 4-cylinder that was the front half of a Miller 310 or 5-liter inline 8 was the answer for the 151 cubic inch class. This class of competition turned out to be ripe for the picking. The races in these smaller displacement classes used tight one-buoy turns, so to be effective, the engines used in these small boats needed a lot of low-end torque to drive the boat off of the tight corners. Frontenac-headed Fords and cut-down Duesenberg engines were dominating, but they had kind of tapped themselves out. They were making as much power as they would make. There needed to be something new with growth potential, and this got Miller's cranks spinning. As luck would have it, Miller actually had a boat that fit into this class, so making the engine made even more sense. It is suggested by some that boat racer Dick Loynes proposed the idea to Miller for this engine, and others say it was his own brainstorm, but either way it happened. In December of 1926, he had the first one in his boat, which was called Angelus I. Ralph Snoddy, who was Miller's marine engine specialist, drove the craft to a 43-mile-per-hour speed, which was the best ever recorded for a 151 cubic inch naturally aspirated boat. The 151 engine is truly the father of the Offy, even though they share no parts, and you can stick with me here and I'll explain that to you in a few minutes. The Miller 151 had a bore of 3.406 inches or 77 millimeters and a stroke of 4.24 inches or 107 millimeters, making 150.4 cubic inches, and again, that comes out to about 2.5 liters. It also used 5 main bearings, a hemispherical combustion chamber with 2 valves, weighed 440 pounds, and sat just over 37 inches long. Naturally aspirated in 1927 with 7-to-1 compression, it made 108 horsepower at 4,250 RPM, and the selling price was $1,100. Adding a supercharger was an additional $400, and upped the power to 188.6 at 4,600 RPM, and lastly, in 1929, a high-compression, big camshaft, naturally aspirated version made 124.5 horsepower at 4,700 RPM. Through the 1927 and 28 time frame, the 151 was dominant on the water. Blown, they were setting speed records of over 60 miles per hour. Unblown, they were running nearly 50. Also in 27, a funny thing happened. Somebody put one of these engines in a car. The debate over who had the idea first or who was the first one to use it is kind of immaterial, but at Ascot and other West Coast tracks, these engines started to show up in small numbers. In 1928, Floyd Smith and Wilbur Shaw took their car to Daytona Beach to set a speed record for 4-cylinder automobiles. The number to beat was 141 miles per hour. Now, they attempted to do this with a Frontenac-headed Model A Ford, but the engine caught fire and caused Shaw to actually drive the machine into the surf to put the fire out. This happened to be in February, but they knew they had another shot at the record coming in April. A phone call went out to Miller, and a land-prepped 151 was purchased for slightly less than $4,000. The engine 8 pistons, 8 valve springs, and other parts. The car only went 135 miles per hour, which was well short of the record. It was at this time that Wilbur Shaw decided to kind of go rogue. He sourced parts from other vendors, fixed the engine, and then went on a winning tear across the country. He got broad-nose cams to add extra valve overlap from Ed Winfield, and then he went out and attacked the board tracks, the dirt tracks, and wherever else he could race. By 1929, loads of these engines were being raced. Now, the downside was the extremely heavy crankshaft actually hampered the engine's ability to rev quickly, and that hampered acceleration off the corners. Now, Bill White had taken his engine out to 183 cubic inches, and at the 1930 Indy 500, there were 7 unblown Miller 4-cylinder engines in the field, 5 of them were at 183 cubic inches. Shorty Cantlin qualified third and finished second to the astonishment of all. This was the high point of success for the 151 on land. Its record on water was far better. Now it's here we have to revisit our main protagonist in Harry Miller. While it may be unkind, it's not false or inaccurate to say that he was an absolutely horrible businessman. He was easily bored, and once he lost interest in a project, he'd abandon it. He was also easily distracted. As the 91 was dominating the race car tracks of America and the 151 was winning on the water, Harry Miller started to get reckless. He built 4, 6, 8, 12, 16, and 24-cylinder speedboat engines, V8 and V16 front-wheel drive passenger cars, a flat 8 for airplanes, and when none of those really panned out, he started spending less and less time in the factory and more time at his huge ranch in the mountains of Los Angeles, a place that was basically a zoo filled with animals and seemingly one of all of God's creations. As the money was coming in with the speed of a hurricane, these side quests, which were costly but didn't really affect the day-to-day operations of the plant, certainly kept everybody busy. But the whole operation was speeding toward a brick wall, and that wall was called the Great Depression. Before the stock market crash, Harry Miller became a very wealthy man. In 1929, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway announced the famed junk formula. This was an effort to try to reel in costs and get automakers back into the 500-mile race. Harry Miller didn't want to comply or alter his approach for this new concept, and as it turned out, he wouldn't have to. In late 1928, Harry Miller was approached about selling his entire business. An outfit called the Schofield Company offered to buy the whole place, everything, and everyone in it. The company planned to make cars, boats, airplanes, and they'd be powered by Miller engines. The money guys at the Schofield outfit wanted Miller to stay on board and run the technical side of the company. And on February 3, 1929, Harry Miller signed the papers. He received $122,000 in cash, or about $2.2 million today. He'd be paid $1,500 a month, receive a percentage of profits, and he got $400,000 of company stock. He signed a non-compete agreement that had a term of 5 years. Fred Offenhauser left. He sold his home, moved into a smaller house, and took a job finishing a Miller V8 front-wheel drive passenger car for Philip Chancellor. He worked with Eddie Offit, one of the original engineers of the company, on this project, and he also opened a small, bare-bones machine shop of his own. When the stock market collapsed, the Schofield Company was placed on its last legs. Miller, on the other hand, had new ideas. In March of 1930, in defiance of his non-compete order, he spent $79,000 to open his own state-of-the-art machine shop for engine building and named it Rilima. Those were his initials backwards. With designer Walter Steele and a rehired Fred Offenhauser, Harry Miller was back in business, and he was doomed. Miller's complete lack of business sense or ability saw the outfit making all the wrong decisions. He developed a high-speed F-head conversion for the Model A engine, sold it to the Vosburg brothers, who planned to market it and mass manufacture it, and he did this after he had already sold it to Krager, and the Vosburg brothers sued him for $61,000. In 1931 and 32, Miller was trying to close deals to keep the business running. He chased exotic boat, car, and airplane engine projects, built the magically awesome Miller 16 for boat racing legend Gar Wood. He built a 183 cubic inch inline 8 funded by Henry Hart that won the Indy 500 that year, and listened to Fred Offenhauser incessantly beg him to allow he and Goossen to design a simple, compact 4-cylinder engine for dirt racing. Miller was bored by this idea, was not appealed by it, and certainly felt it was beneath what he had been accomplishing already. Dirt racing was still very popular during the Depression, but it was fairly low rung when you consider boat racing and things like the Indy 500. Now, he blew these guys off until the financial situation of the company was getting so dire he needed a Hail Mary, and the project was finally given the green light. Harry Miller stopped spending time at racetracks except for the Indianapolis 500 for a few years before this moment. Fred Offenhauser was there on a weekly basis. He saw Krager, Peugeot, Frontenac, and Winfield-headed Model A Ford engines dominating on a weekly basis. While Miller didn't care about this greasy-knuckle style of racing, Offenhauser saw money, and he saw potential as those listed options were easily beaten with an engine of even modest design on a clean sheet of paper. The design they came up with in late 1930 was for a 4-cylinder engine using dual overhead camshafts, 4 valves per cylinder, 1.5-inch intake or 38mm intake valves, and 1.35-inch exhaust valves, 35 millimeters, with a pent roof style combustion chamber and a 72-degree valve angle. The engine had 5 main bearings and a strong but light crankshaft, which had 2.25-inch or 57mm mains and two 1.125-inch or 54mm throw in the crank. A beautiful tower of gears in the front of the engine drove the camshafts, which were made by Ed Winfield and had 385 lift to start with and maxed out at 400 lift with factory options. Using a cast iron one-piece cylinder block and aluminum pistons, the engine had 7.5-inch long steel rods, a billet steel crank, poured Babbitt bearings, 5 of them, dry sump oiling, and a magneto set to fire at 35 degrees before top dead center. The block was 25.87 inches or 657 millimeters long with no bell housing on it. It was 12.25 inches or 311 millimeters wide and 30.38 or 771 millimeters tall. It was a mean little breadbox of a thing, and the original examples made about 150 horsepower at 5,000 RPM. Decades later, this same engine would be making more than 10 times that amount of power. The engine weighed 325 pounds with an iron cylinder block and aluminum barrel-shaped crankcase. The initial version, with its 3.875-inch or 98.4 millimeter bore and 4.25-inch or 107.9 millimeter stroke, was 200 cubic inches or 3.3 liters. 6 of them were sold. The listed opening price for this engine was $2,750 for first-run engines and then $2,000 after that. Now, the first early few were built, and they fared well at the 500, which caused the phone to ring and hopes to rise. In 1931, a version with a 4.0025-inch bore was offered to make it 220 cubic inches. Now, Art Sparks was one of the first buyers. Sparks didn't have the money to buy the engine assembled, so he bought it in pieces, and his friend, who was an ice delivery man, picked the engine up at the plant in his ice wagon, with all the parts hanging off the side of the ice wagon. The engine was a winner from the start, won championships on dirt, and won races around the country. In 1933, Offenhauser successfully lobbied Miller for a 255 cubic inch displacement version of this engine. Amazingly, all the valve train parts and dimensions on this engine were identical to the 1,113 cubic inch or 18.5 liter Miller V16. It's kind of wild to consider. The 255 was the last shot to save the company. Incredibly, the 255 was perceived to be so good even before it showed up that the Automobile Association of America, that sanctioned most of the major races in the country, changed the displacement limit to all tracks other than the Indianapolis Motor Speedway and mile-long speedway courses to 220 cubic inches, and this was done to block the 255 from continuing to dominate. Now, clearly these guys had a winner, but it was too little too late. On July 8, 1933, Harry Miller filed for bankruptcy. The government padlocked the facility, and that was that. It had been horrible. The staff had not been paid their full wages for at least 6 months. Offenhauser, who was operating his small shop on the side to stay afloat, made an agreement with Miller to trade machines for pay. Offenhauser had not actually drawn a paycheck from Miller on the order of 2 years. So when things really started to get bad and business really started to collapse, Offenhauser had begun, with Miller's consent, to take machine tools from the factory, and he brought those to his own workshop. The fact the guy had worked for 2 years without getting an actual paycheck, and over the course of that time had slid money to the other workers on the side to make sure they could feed themselves, was admirable, if not kind of crazy. Miller had taken many plans before the doors were locked, but after the factory was locked down, curiously, plans, patterns, and other things kept being liberated from the supposedly sealed-off building. The government never caught anyone, but one can only make so many guesses as to who would be motivated and knowledgeable enough to get in and out, know where the things were, and not get caught grabbing them. This calamitous period of time is the Offy's first great escape from certain doom. A heartbroken Fred Offenhauser was working in his small, bare-bones machine shop, staffed with guys like Walt Sobraski from the Miller factory. They were mostly repairing truck engines to pay the bills and doing some small racing jobs on the side. In fact, Offenhauser, like he had done years ago, had taken over the project of completing a Miller V16-powered road car for a customer. He charged $15,000 for the job, hired Eddie Offutt, another one of the original engineers from Miller, and financed the first 3 official months of the Offenhauser Engineering Company with that money. There's a better than average chance that Offenhauser was among those making clandestine trips to the padlock factory to get plans and drawings and patterns and whatever else they could carry out, and he likely saw the end of the business coming before others because of his position and keen awareness of the way a machine shop should work functionally. Another guy whose name pops back into the story is Dick Loyness. At the property auction, he paid $25 for some of the Goossen 255 cubic inch engine technical drawings. He also ended up with the patterns as well. Offenhauser ended up with drawings, patterns, and jigs for the 220 cubic inch engine. Loyness went into business for a period of time selling copies of the blueprints and rough castings made from the specs of the paperwork he had, but he never sold complete engines. He didn't sell a ton of them, but he did have some notable customers like Louis Meyer. Frank Briscoe also had some of the technical information on the engines, but again, was unable to really make a go of moving them in any volume. Now this left Offenhauser, whose relationship with Leo Goossen was the most powerful thing he had going. Goossen finished all the drawings for the 255 cubic inch variant of the four-cylinder after the bankruptcy. Fred Offenhauser got them. With those drawings and with some of the good machining talent and engineering talent that came from the Miller factory, he was able to start running those machines, and he knew the vendors who had been making the parts, and now Fred Offenhauser could go into the engine manufacturing business. His 2- and sometimes 3-man shop in early 1933 became a 7-man operation by Christmas of that same year. By that time, he was actively advertising engines for sale, and by January of 1934, 255 cubic inch engine parts were being made in volume. Out of respect, maybe even reverence for his former boss, Offenhauser called these engines Millers at first. But by mid-1934, they were being marketed as Offenhausers. Fred had sold a half dozen 255s by May of 1934, and business was officially booming. He estimated that each engine took approximately 1,500 man-hours of labor to complete end to end. His Leo Goossen drawn 255 cubic inch engine had a bore of 4 1/4 inches or 108 millimeters and a stroke of 4.5 inches or 114 millimeters, 5 main bearings, 4 valves per cylinder, a pent roof combustion chamber, and a carburetor with a 1 3/4 inch throat. The block was slightly larger than the 220 cubic inch Miller, and the mains themselves had been expanded by 1/8 of an inch. With 13-to-1 compression and a 5,200 RPM redline, the 345-pound engines were making near 200 horsepower when they left the small machine works of Offenhauser in California. Offenhauser ran his operation exactly the opposite as Miller. The pay was meager, the hours unrelenting, and there were zero frills at the shop for the men. Having seen what had happened before, understanding the shifting fortunes of racing could change rapidly, Offenhauser was obsessed with running the tightest possible ship, making the best product, and not suffering the distractions or deviations that Miller had had, and ultimately that had put him out of business. In 1934, 13 Miller 4s competed at the Indy 500. The finishers ranked 1, 2, 3, 4, 9, and 11. This was very good for Offenhauser's business because he was the only place to get these engines now. Also in 1934, another trend caught the attention of Goossen and Offenhauser, and that trend was midget racing. The sport was starting to really gain strength across the country, especially on the West Coast. Goossen designed a 97 cubic inch engine, which was basically half of the famed 181 inline 8. It had 2 valves per cylinder rather than 4, but was easily produced and came to market quickly. He sold 5 the first year and would ultimately produce more than 100 of them before World War II, averaging about a dozen a year. This was another huge hit that helped to fund the company. The first 255 cubic inch 4-cylinder engine carrying the Offenhauser name won the Indy 500 in 1935. Kelly Patillo was the driver, and the story is great. Patillo approached Offenhauser with no money and asked to buy an engine on credit, promising to pay it off with his winnings from the 500. Offenhauser, never one to go for schemes like this, actually said yes. The then $3,500 engine was handed over to Patillo, installed in his car, and away they went to the Speedway. Unqualified and down to his last $18 in the world, Patillo broke the engine. Offenhauser at the Speedway, as usual, agreed to rush ship parts from California, but the cost, $800, would be added to Patillo's tab. This raised his overall bill to $4,300. Kelly Patillo qualified, and during a wacky, strange, rain-shortened 500, he worked his way to the front and won the race, earning $35,000. The big bet he had placed on himself and the one that Fred Offenhauser had placed on Kelly Patillo paid off. He also went on to win the 1935 AAA Championship. Offenhauser produced 11 engines in 1935 from the success of Kelly Patillo. In 1936, the company made 9 engines for the Indy 500, and Louis Meyer drove one to a victory, and that was back-to-back wins for Fred Offenhauser. Miller and Offy engines comprised 68% of the field in 1936. By 1937, the shop had 15 men working in it, and outside of the large volumes of parts and pieces they were making, they made 16 complete engines with a twist. Offenhauser was now offering 255 cubic inch, 270 cubic inch, and 318 cubic inch 5.2-liter variants of the engine. The price was $2,500 for one of those and $1,175 for one of his 97 cubic inch Midget engines. The Lou Moore Indy 500 entry won the race in 1937 with a 270 cubic inch Offy. Now, for the next 20 years, this 270 cubic inch Offy would be the standard by which all others were measured. The 270 cubic inch displacement mill was identical to the 255, with the exception of an increased bore to 4.3125 inches, or 109.5 millimeters, and a stroke of 4.625 inches, or 117.4 millimeters. Wilbur Shaw drove this car to victory, and the phone began ringing again. More than 20 engines were produced that year. The big 318 cubic inch version of the Offy is less known, and it was designated for the IMCA Dirt Racing Series, which did allow for larger engines. The bore was 4.5 inches, and the stroke was 5 inches in this case to make the larger displacement 318. In 1938, 5 of the first 6 finishers were Offy engines. He also had Goossen design some taller deck blocks that allowed for longer connecting rods to be used, or a taller piston dome depending on the direction a buyer wanted to take. The quality of workmanship and care taken by Offy and his men made the legacy of the engine. It wasn't just that they made power, it was that they were built right and could handle a lot of abuse. Just the heat treating alone was amazing in the shop. The blocks were heated to 1250 degrees Fahrenheit or 677 degrees centigrade and allowed to cool for 12 hours in the process. In fact, most of the components in the engine were heat-treated and done so in a very exacting manner, unlike the way it was done at Miller, which was willy-nilly and caused a lot of mechanical issues. In May of 1940, defense work started to flood the machining marketplace, and that included the machine shop of Fred Offenhauser. Those defense contracts were so lucrative, they were the first thing that caused Offy to take his engine and place it in the back seat rather than making it a priority. In 1941, a 270 cubic inch Offy won the Indy 500 again, and Fred Offenhauser had actually turned into somewhat of a celebrity. Famous actors and other celebrities would come to the shop to meet him and spend time with him. Offenhauser landed sizable defense contracts, the most lucrative of which centered around building booster controllers for P-38 airplanes, and this took his business to heights unknown. On January 4th, 1941, Offenhauser opened a new 7,000-square-foot shop that would house his now 28 employees. He invited 400 guests, had a 5-piece band, and it was a soiree to remember. Meanwhile, Harry Miller had been fumbling through a series of failed projects, ventures, and schemes, and was about 2 years from a sad and lonely end in Detroit. The fortunes of the two men could not have worked out any more differently in the end. As one can imagine, the engine business and virtually all auto racing of significance was stopped during the war. But consider this. From 1934 through 1941, Offenhauser had won 7 of 15 100-mile AAA races held, 4 Indy 500s, 3 AAA championships, held a 94% qualifying rate at the Indy 500, and had produced nearly 100 complete engines in the process. Not so bad for a guy who started in a greasy small shop repairing truck engines. The war workload was crushing. Offenhauser worked 7 days a week, 7:30 a.m. to 9 p.m. Monday through Saturday, and 7:30 a.m. to 4 p.m. on Sundays and holidays. The shop ran 3 shifts, non-stop, for a few years. After the war ended, Fred Offenhauser knew 2 things. For starters, he knew he was nearly 60 years old, and secondly, he knew he had earned enough money to live the rest of his life comfortably and had no interest in ending his life as Miller did his own. He wanted to sell the business, but Offy being Offy, It had to go to the right people, and those people had to be racers. Louis Meyer was one of the great stars of the Indy 500 and a 3-time winner. When he suffered a massive crash in 1939 that appeared as though it should have killed him, his family and even his close friend Henry Ford told him he needed to quit on the spot. Henry Ford set Meyer up with a man named Lou Welch. The two of those guys went into business together on a Ford engine rebuilding factory in California. Of course, as you've learned in some of my other videos, Lou Welch would go on to fund the development of the Novi V8 engine of Indianapolis 500 fame. Meyer was bored of this enterprise after a few years and decided to sell all his shares out to Welch. By this time, the word was out that Offenhauser was looking to sell his company. Lou Welch approached him but was rebuffed. Welch actually wasn't that well-liked a guy in racing circles and wasn't seen as a real racer, especially in the eyes of a man like Offenhauser, so he just wasn't the right guys to give the keys to. After Meyer had split from Welch, he opened a small machine shop with his friend Dale Drake. It was a humble place, but when Offenhauser heard about it, he planned to visit. Dale Drake was the son of a blacksmith and had machines in his blood. His family operated the J.A. Drake & Son Manufacturing Company, which sold very high-quality, forged automotive valves. They were sold under the Jadson brand. Dale Drake loved airplanes and was a glider pilot of great skill. That wasn't until 1928, which was the year the federal government started requiring pilots to license, and he felt this was an infringement on his freedom, so he never flew again. In 1937, Jadson was sold. Drake opened his own machine shop, developed his own V-twin-style midget engine, did war work, and made a small successful business out of it. He teamed up with Louis Meyer to grow the business. In 1946, Fred Offenhauser walked in, sat down, and made the boys an offer they could not refuse. For an upfront payment of $75,000 and some continuing payments for a period after that, he'd hand them the keys. It took little debate or negotiation, and the deal was done. Fred Offenhauser took $60,000 of his $75,000 payout and immediately invested it all into blue-chip stocks and took the other $15,000 into his bank account. After having produced 180 midget engines, 30 220 cubic inch engines, and more than 50 255 and 270 cubic inch Indy engines, along with custom jobs and innumerable parts, Fred Offenhauser was officially retired from the engine business. What Meyer and Drake got wasn't just the plants, they got it all, including a lot of worn-out, overworked machines from the war, 25 machinists at the Offy plant as well as the guys in their own shop, and a backlog of 50 orders for engines that had poured in just after the close of World War II. It was now time for Meyer and Drake to put their stamp on the legacy of this incredible engine. The men upgraded the machines and took the Offenhauser machine shop, thoroughly modernized its process, and made the place far more businesslike. They were producing 3 midget engines a week by the end of 1946 and early 1947. Now, by 1948, demand of midget engines fell off, but they were still making 50-some a year. Through the 1950s, the Offenhauser dominated the Indy 500 with such impunity there were complaints. Same with the story in sprint cars and sprint car racing as well. Experiments were made like a smaller 176 cubic inch 2.9-liter supercharged version of the engine, and a man named Herb Porter was a leading figure for that combo. Now, his work and frustration will be a very important part of our story shortly. In the late 1950s, the laydown style Offenhauser became a trend. Laying the Offenhauser engine on its side to lower the profile and center of gravity in the car, it was a pretty easy thing for the guys to adapt to. They had to make some basic oiling tweaks, but other than that, the engines were all the same. In 1957, A.J. Watson asked for a special short tower version of the engine. Again, this was done to lessen the frontal area of a car he was building. Coming out to 255 cubic inches, this engine made 360 horsepower at 6,500 RPM, which was a pretty substantial increase over the 5,200 RPM redline used in the 270-inch version of the engine. The block height was reduced to 10.953 inches, or 278.2 millimeters. One of the reasons the shop was able to accommodate this modification so easily is because the gear drive tower from the 220 cubic inch engine fit this one perfectly, so it was a relatively easy and inexpensive thing to do. Consider this. From 1950 through 1962, 424 of the 429 cars that qualified for the Indy 500 had Offenhauser power. On the AAA Championship Trail, most racetracks 1 mile and down on dirt, 255 and 270 cubic inches won every race but 2 in 17 years, a span of October 1946 through August of 1963. The only exceptions were Pikes Peak, which was a points-gathering race where the Offys were bested twice over that entire period of time. Finally, a challenger arrived, and it was a big one. Not just a challenger, but a colossus looking to do whatever it took to stop the Offy from winning anything ever again. What was the indicator to Meyer and Drake that their reign was to be contested? The Ford Motor Company purchased Offenhauser 270 cubic inch engine serial number 215 in 1962. Amazingly, the guys actually helped, even sending people to Detroit to help Ford get the engine set up properly. Now, it sounds confusing, right? We have to actually consider motivations here. As it turns out, Louis Meyer wanted to sell Offenhauser to Ford, and he had actively offered it to them without asking Dale Drake. Meyer wanted to capitulate to the automotive superpower, but Drake wanted to fight it out. As we all know, and I've talked about in other videos, Ford came to the Indy 500 with their pushrod engine in 1963. Now, that engine ran well, but Parnelli Jones won in an Offy-powered roadster. In 1964, Rolla Volstedt showed up with the first rear-engine Offenhauser-powered entry, and Jimmy Clark was there in a rear-engine Lotus with Ford's dazzling new dual-overhead cam V8. Amazingly, A.J. Foyt beat them all with an Offenhauser-powered roadster. In 1965, Ford won the Indy 500 with their engine, reportedly one they had spent north of $10 million to develop. All of this to stop the four-cylinder with its roots in the 1920s. The fastest Ford went 161.233 miles per hour to capture the pole. The fastest Offy was 158.416. At the finish, the closest Offenhauser-powered car was 5 minutes behind Jimmy Clark. It was the first time the Offy had failed to win the Indy 500 since 1946. After the race, Ford actually hired Louis Meyer to be their sales and service agent for the dual-overhead cam V8 engine. And look, for Meyer, this was a pragmatic decision. He had kept good contacts with Ford since he was first in their good graces in the 30s, and the massive company was going to squash Drake like a bug. So he got on the bus before being run over by it. Meyer moved to Indy, and once he got there, started saying some things that were kind of nasty. He started telling people that the Offy was dead, that there wouldn't be any manufactured in 1966, and that the future was all Ford-powered. Meanwhile, Ford actually had guys working at the Meyer-Drake machine shop in California. Those guys finally annoyed Dale Drake enough that he threw them out. Then he got a letter from Louis Meyer offering his half of the company for sale. Drake didn't blink, and he wrote the check. In 1967, the company was renamed Drake Engineering and Sales. Many people assumed that with the departure of Louis Meyer, with Dale Drake on his own, that the Offenhauser was absolutely and forever dead and buried. Dale Drake and Leo Goossen had other ideas. Drake, in a move of some defiance, actually changed the look of the valve covers of the car. He had the words Drake Offy cast into them so the whole world would know when they looked at the engine that Meyer had bailed on the operation. At this time in history, an Offenhauser cost $12,500 complete, and a Ford dual-overhead cam V8 cost $30,000. By now at Indianapolis, only 25% of the field had Offenhauser power. This was a quick and kind of astonishing drop in fortunes. Things looked pretty bad for the Offy at this time. Midget racing was moving towards stock block engines, and they seemingly couldn't compete at Indy. The small block Chevy was taking off in sprint cars, and more challengers seemed to be rising every day. It truly looked like the little engine company was actually cornered. There was exactly one way out of this predicament, and it was a path that even back to the days of Fred Offenhauser, people had been trying and failing to get down. That, of course, was the use of boost. Supercharged engines could be run at the speedway at under 200 cubic inches displacement, and some guys had tried. Herb Porter, who I mentioned before, was the most obsessed with the small displacement supercharged Offy combination. He had been trying since the early 1950s with little to no success. The engine made big power, but getting it to survive over 500 miles was the magic, and it was simply a trick he couldn't solve. As it would turn out, another company that was getting beat up at the speedway would come to the aid of Dale Drake in this pursuit to save the Offy. And it was Champion Spark Plugs, who had seen a similar fate to Offenhauser with the rise of Autolite spark plugs at the Speedway. Dick Jones was their dyno guy and by all accounts, one of the finest engine men in the country. Drake, Champion, and Jones got together, and the game was on. The Champion dyno was only 10 miles from Drake's shop, and it became the epicenter of a crash program to boost the Offy back into success. Leo Goossen made design changes to the engine. He shortened the stroke, and he shortened it 0.625 inches or 15 millimeters to make it a total of 3.125 inches or 79.3 millimeters. The bore was 4 1/8 inches or 104.77 millimeters. This created an over-square four-cylinder of 167 cubic inches, which was called a 168. All other elements of the engine were kept the same. Now, the boost. Root superchargers and centrifugals were considered. Turbochargers are on the table as well. Now, there have been serious designs on doing even a compound-style engine here with a turbocharger feeding a roots blower, but that one never got far enough down the road to test. A two-pronged approach was taken here. Herb Porter was chosen to be the guy to lead the faction of supercharged entries, and Bob DeBishop of A Research would lead the turbocharger experiments. Now, early turbo test engines made 570 horsepower at 6,400 RPM. Porter's roots-blown engines try 540 horsepower at 7,900 RPM. That was with 15 pounds of boost on 171 cubic inches. Paul Goldsmith wanted a special test done on the engine he had built. It made 545 horsepower at 9,000 RPM. In February of 1966, Parnelli Jones tested a roots-blown Offy at Phoenix. He ran a lap speed of 123.49 miles per hour, which absolutely obliterated the standing track record to that point. Improved manufacturing tolerances and incremental improvements in materials and processes are what allowed the red line of these engines to really grow from the former 5,200 RPM. In April, A.J. Foyt tested the first turbocharged variant of an Offenhauser in Phoenix. Over 4 days of learning to drive the car and mechanics learning to tune it, the performance was stunning. A handful of teams snapped at the chance to go the turbocharged route. 17 blown 168 cubic inch Offenhauser engines were built for the 1966 Indy 500. Leo Goossen was put into service to make some changes to the turbocharged variant of the engine. The crankcase was made stronger, the block was recast to move the exhaust ports to better deal with the heat, and the turbocharger upgrade kit could be bought from Drake for $3,500. A turbocharged Roadster ran over 160 miles per hour for the first time, which was the fastest a Roadster had ever gone to that point in history. All the turbocharged entries blew up before having any measurable impact on the race. 3 supercharged Offy engines actually qualified. Parnelli Jones qualified his blown car 4th behind 3 Fords. He went 162.484 miles per hour. Crummily, a wheel bearing failure on lap 87 sunk him to a 14th place finish. Block porosity issues and other issues were plaguing many of the teams at this time as well. In 1966, knowing what was happening behind the scenes with Drake and the Power Adders, Louis Meyer aggressively asked Ford to start turbocharging their engines. He was basically laughed out of the room despite his impassioned arguments. Dan Jones of Ford had actually heard what Meyer was saying. Jones started a clandestine program off the books to turbocharge a dual overhead cam V8. It was off the radar, but he also believed that Ford would be in trouble when the Offy boost situation was figured out. In 1967, Lloyd Ruby ran his Offy Mongoose to a speed of 165.229, the best ever for the engine to that point. He qualified 7th and was parked after 3 laps with a valve failure. 1 roots-blown Offy qualified in 67. 7 turbocharged cars were at the race. None of them did anything to make the headlines. In 1968, after a couple of years of diligent, frustrating, and sometimes expensive work, Bobby Unser, piloting a turbocharged Offy-powered Gurney Eagle, won the Indy 500. He qualified 3rd with the engine wicked up to 625 horsepower and started the race with a more conservative 590 horsepower tune-up with a simple wastegate adjustment. That same year, Ford sent 7 turbocharged dual overhead cam engines, and 4 of them qualified, but none of them finished. Offenhauser had 9 of the top 11 spots. They'd win 15 championship car races that season to Ford's 9. 1969 meant smaller engines. The rules reduced overall displacement to 159.4 cubic inches, or 2.65 liters. That was the maximum for blown entries. But that wasn't the biggest problem. Once again, Ford's corporate monster went to work, spending reportedly north of $10 million on its turbocharger development program. They came back and won 1969, 1970, and 1971. But it was after the 1969 race that Ford announced they were done, and they cut all funding from the IndyCar program. Why did they do that? The official reasoning for it was that they were redirecting the engineering money to other OE-style study and development work, but the reality of the situation is they had made internal reports that said it was going to cost the company on the order of $35 million to build a new, completely clean sheet engine that could continue to stay with the Offenhauser in its rising power levels. The dual overhead cam engine was tapped out, and the Offy, as their engineers knew, had way more to go. By 1972, the Offy had overtaken the Fords again. Their development stunted, the Offy being constantly worked on. It was back to being Offyville, USA at the Speedway. Even Lou Meyer, after the Ford program closed, went back to helping and consulting with the Offy-powered teams. That same year, Lou Meyer sold his company, Meyer Incorporated, and retired to his 100-acre place in Indiana. George Bignotti, one of the greatest crew chiefs in Indy 500 history, was the guy who actually bought Meyer Inc. 1972 was a sad year for another reason. Dale Drake died suddenly. His son, wife, and Leo Goossen took over the business and forged ahead. Also in 1972, Leo Goossen made some design tweaks to the Offy. He created a 159 cubic version of the engine and got it dyno tested at 40 pounds of boost. The engine made 1,200 horsepower and was recognized as having the highest power output per displacement of any engine in history to that time, making a little more than 7.5 horsepower per cubic inch. During one dyno session, a wastegate froze and the engine made 1,400 horsepower, turning a terrifying 10,200 RPM. Drake was making 20-plus turbocharged race engines a year in the early 70s, and had there never been boost or fuel mileage regulations put into place at the Indy 500, the Offenhauser may still be evolving, and there's no reason to believe that the engine still wouldn't be competitive to this day. Although in its time, its fuel consumption would have been an issue, especially as we moved into more modern eras. In 1973, Johnny Rutherford went 198.413 miles per hour average in qualifying, including the fastest single lap ever recorded by an Offenhauser-powered car at 199.071. The Offy machines dominated the 500 and the whole Champ Car schedule, winning 13 races. Fred Offenhauser died on August 17, 1973, having lived an incredible life. One of measured dignity, hard-nosed business practices, brilliant mental and physical talent, and one that left a name American racing fans will talk about into coming centuries. In 1974, boost was restricted to 25 psi and fuel tanks to 40 gallons, and Offenhauser still won. 11 of the top 12 qualifiers were Offenhausers. The oil crisis put the clamps on racing and really hampered the Drake engineering business. A new version of the Offy was created as an offshoot in 1974 called the Drake, Goossen, and Sparks Offy. A narrowed valve angle to 44 degrees, a different combustion chamber design, new pistons, and the typically Siamese ports of the Offenhauser engine were made separate. The bore and stroke was 4.281 inches, or 108.7 millimeters, and 2.75 inches of stroke at 69.85 millimeters to make 158 cubes. The engine made 800 horsepower at 9,000 RPM under the new regulations. 12 of them were sold. Leo Goossen worked right up till the end. He died on December 4, 1974. No American racing engine or car designer before or since has had such a significant and long-lasting impact as Leo Goossen did. He lived an incredible life, a life that still gives us the fruits of his labors in different engine designs today. In 1975, Dale Drake made his own changes to the engine. Some say the valve angle was moved to 36 degrees, some say 38, but it's somewhere in that range. The stroke went to 2.65 inches, or 67.3 millimeters. 24 of these engines were sold over the course of the ensuing years in the late 70s. In 75, A.J. Foyt won the pole in an Offenhauser-powered car at 193.976 miles per hour, and Bobby Unser won with Offy power, averaging 191.652 miles per hour over his fastest laps. 29 of the 33 cars that year were Offy-powered, and in qualifying trim, could make 1,200 horsepower at 10,000 RPM. In race trim, they were dialed back to 870 horsepower at 9,000 RPM. These would officially be the last of the good days. In 1975, something else happened. The Cosworth V8 showed up, and in 1976, it came back with a turbo. The boost was again trimmed back by the rules makers and the car slowed down. By 1977, with increasing pressure and rules restrictions, the Offy was down about 100 horsepower to the Cosworth. Dale Drake's son conceived an Offy V8 to battle the Cosworths, but the project never saw the light of day. Drake Engineering and Sales Company ran out of money and time, and in 1979, it closed for good. That year, there were 12 Offy-powered cars in the field versus 20 Cosworths. In 1980, only 3 Offy-powered cars qualified. Gary Bettenhausen finished third, though, which is amazing. In 1981, Rolla Volstad's car, driven by Tom Sneva, qualified at 187.784 miles per hour, good enough for the 8th row. Unfortunately, the run was protested and then disqualified, and they did not get to run again. It would be the first race in 46 years without an Offy, and the first time since 1929 that there wasn't a 4-cylinder engine in the race. In 1982, 5 Offys tried at the Speedway, but none qualified. In 1983, the last Offenhauser to show up and compete never got the shot to qualify because of rain. No one brought one to qualify again. 57 years since that 1926 Miller 151 Marine engine got this whole thing started, it was over. An engine that made about 125 horsepower when it was introduced was making more than 1,200 at its peak with relatively few changes over the years. It was a design that simply got everything right. Its strength was legend, its sound a calling card for the ages, and its complete and utter domination of the American racing scene for more than a half a century will never be repeated. The men who created the engine, designed the engine, machined its parts, modified it over the years, and shepherded it through its darkest days are all gearhead heroes, the best of the best. Harry Miller had visions in his mind. Leo Goossen was able to make them into producible things, and Fred Offenhauser, the master machinist, was able to take Goossen's interpretations of Miller's fantasies, make them complete, operable, and championship-winning engines. Dale Drake and Louis Meyer carried the work on of their forefathers to places no one had dreamed possible. I know this has been a long story, but the story of the Offenhauser engine deserves to be told in a long form. It's among the greatest in American gearhead history. I'm Brian Loans. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more engine, horsepower, in-depth, and amazing history. See you next time.